In the autumn of 1823, deep within the pine forests of Burlington County, New Jersey, I stumbled upon documents that would forever change my understanding of what science chooses to acknowledge and what it deliberately ignores. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore Estate had been abandoned for nearly 2 centuries, its Gothic stone walls crumbling beneath centuries of neglect, when construction workers preparing the site for a new residential development made a discovery that stopped all work. Indefinitely. Hidden beneath the estate's foundation, they found a sealed chamber containing research journals, anatomical specimens, and correspondence that revealed one of the most disturbing scientific experiments in American history. The 5 Whitmore sisters had operated what appeared to be a progressive medical research facility during the early 19th century, decades before such establishments became common. Local historians had always praised the sisters as pioneering women in medicine, ahead of their time in treating ailments that conventional doctors of the era couldn't cure. But the documents I discovered told a far different story, one so disturbing that when I attempted to publish my findings, 3 major universities refused to acknowledge the research, and 2 medical journals declined to print even a summary of the evidence. What I found in that sealed chamber wasn't just historical curiosity. It was proof of systematic human experimentation conducted with a level of scientific rigor that wouldn't be seen again until the darkest chapters of 20th century medical research. The Whitmore sisters had developed techniques for studying human consciousness, pain tolerance, and biological adaptation that were centuries ahead of their time. More troubling still, their methods had produced results that modern science still cannot explain or replicate. The first journal I opened belonged to Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, the eldest sister, and her meticulous handwriting documented procedures that made my hands shake as I read. Patient observations spanning months, detailed anatomical drawings showing progressive physiological changes, and most disturbing of all, recordings of what she called consciousness transfer experiments. These weren't the crude medical procedures of the early 1800s. These were sophisticated, scientific protocols that demonstrated an understanding of human biology that shouldn't have existed for another century. Local records from the 1820s painted the Whitmore Medical Institute as a beacon of hope for families dealing with conditions that traditional medicine couldn't address. Patients traveled from across the Northeast seeking treatment for mental afflictions, physical deformities, and chronic pain conditions that other doctors had declared incurable. The sisters advertised their services in newspapers throughout New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, promising revolutionary treatments based on the latest European medical advances. The Whitmore family had established themselves in Burlington County during the late 1700s when Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, a physician trained in Edinburgh, purchased 200 acres of forested land and built what would become known as the Whitmore Estate. Dr. Whitmore had studied under some of Europe's most progressive medical minds, and he brought with him techniques and theories that were decades ahead of American medical practice. When consumption claimed his life in 1820, he left behind not only a substantial fortune, but also a private medical library containing texts that wouldn't reach American shores for another generation. His 5 daughters had been raised in this environment of medical innovation and scientific inquiry. Eleanor, the eldest at 28, had received an education equivalent to any male physician of the era, though no medical school would have admitted her. Margaret, 26, possessed an almost supernatural understanding of human anatomy and had assisted in numerous surgical procedures since childhood. Catherine, 24, demonstrated remarkable skills in chemistry and pharmacology, able to compound medications that produced effects her contemporaries couldn't achieve. Sarah, 22, showed exceptional talent in what would later be called psychology, possessing an ability to influence patients' mental states through conversation and suggestion. Rebecca, the youngest at 20, had inherited her father's meticulous nature and maintained detailed records of every procedure, every patient outcome, and every experimental result. The sisters transformed their father's modest medical practice into something far more ambitious. They expanded the estate's medical facilities, adding specialized treatment rooms, a fully equipped surgical theater, and laboratory spaces that rivaled anything found in European medical schools. Most significantly, they constructed a separate residential wing designed to house patients requiring extended treatment periods. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This facility could accommodate up to 20 patients at a time, providing them with comfortable living quarters while they underwent the sisters' revolutionary medical procedures. The Whitmore Medical Institute opened its doors in March 1821 with an announcement in the Philadelphia Inquirer that promised treatments for conditions that conventional medicine had failed to address. The advertisement spoke of breakthrough procedures for mental disturbances, innovative surgical techniques for physical deformities, and experimental treatments for chronic pain conditions that had left patients bedridden for years. Most intriguingly, the sisters claimed to offer hope for families dealing with what they termed consciousness disorders, conditions affecting memory, personality, and cognitive function. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Families desperate for medical solutions they couldn't find elsewhere began making the journey to the remote New Jersey estate. The sisters carefully screened potential patients, accepting only those cases that offered the greatest potential for their research objectives. They preferred patients with rare conditions, unusual symptoms, or medical histories that suggested underlying phenomena that conventional medicine couldn't explain. Thomas Mitchell was among their first patients, a 34-year-old merchant from Albany who had been suffering from what his family described as personality fragmentation following a severe head injury. Mitchell would experience periods where he seemed to become an entirely different person, with different memories, different skills, and even different handwriting. His family had consulted physicians throughout New York without finding any treatment that could stabilize his condition. Eleanor Whitmore took personal charge of Mitchell's case, housing him in the residential wing where she could observe him continuously. Her journal entries from this period reveal a level of scientific methodology that was extraordinary for the era. She documented Mitchell's personality shifts with precise timing, recorded physical changes that accompanied each transformation, and most remarkably, began developing techniques to trigger these changes deliberately. The breakthrough came when Eleanor discovered that specific combinations of pharmaceutical compounds, environmental stimuli, and psychological suggestions could not only trigger Mitchell's personality shifts but actually direct them toward predetermined outcomes. She could essentially program which personality would emerge and how long it would remain dominant. More disturbing still, she began experimenting with creating entirely new personalities, artificial constructs that existed only during chemically induced states. Mitchell's treatment extended over 8 months, during which Eleanor documented procedures that demonstrated an understanding of consciousness manipulation that modern neuroscience is only beginning to approach. She developed techniques for accessing and modifying memory formations, for altering core personality traits, and most remarkably, for what she described as consciousness transfer between subjects. The other sisters contributed their specialized skills to create a comprehensive research program that treated patients as experimental subjects rather than individuals seeking medical care. Margaret's anatomical expertise allowed them to perform surgical procedures that enhanced their ability to study brain function directly. Catherine's pharmaceutical innovations provided them with compounds that could induce specific neurological states while maintaining patient consciousness. Sarah's psychological techniques enabled them to manipulate patients' perceptions and memories with remarkable precision. Rebecca's documentation created a comprehensive record of procedures and outcomes that would have been invaluable to medical science if it hadn't been suppressed. By 1822, the Whitmore Medical Institute had developed what Eleanor described in her journals as a complete system for consciousness modification. They could alter personality traits, implant artificial memories, transfer skills and knowledge between subjects, and most controversially, achieve what they called consciousness preservation in subjects whose physical bodies were failing. Their patient population had grown to include individuals from across the Northeast, many of whom remained at the facility for months or even years as ongoing experimental subjects. The sisters maintained the illusion of conventional medical treatment through carefully crafted correspondence with patients' families. They provided regular updates describing gradual improvements, breakthrough treatments, and the need for extended care periods to ensure lasting results. Families were discouraged from visiting during treatment phases, told that outside influences could interfere with delicate therapeutic processes. This isolation gave the sisters complete control over their subjects and ensured that their experimental procedures remained secret. Rebecca's records from this period reveal the true scope of their research program. Over 150 individuals had been treated at the facility, with outcomes that ranged from successful consciousness modification to what the sisters clinically described as consciousness dissolution. Patients who proved unsuitable for their primary research objectives were used for more basic experiments in pain tolerance, pharmaceutical testing, and surgical technique development. The sisters had created their own medical terminology to quantify, describe procedures that had no equivalent in contemporary medicine. Consciousness grafting involved transferring personality traits or memories from one subject to another. Identity sculpting described their technique for systematically altering core personality characteristics. Memory architecture referred to their method of constructing artificial recollections that subjects would accept as genuine experiences. Most disturbing of all was what they called essence preservation, a procedure they claimed could maintain consciousness independently of physical brain function. Eleanor's journal entries from late 1822 suggest that the sisters had achieved results that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human consciousness. They had successfully transferred memories between subjects, created hybrid personalities combining traits from multiple individuals, and according to their records, maintained conscious awareness in subjects whose brains had been severely damaged or partially removed. The facility's patient population during this period included individuals whose families believed they were recovering from various medical conditions. In reality, these subjects were undergoing systematic consciousness modification that transformed them into entirely different people. The sisters would return modified subjects to their families with explanations that personality changes were natural results of their medical treatments, side effects that would stabilize over time. Catherine's pharmaceutical research had produced compounds that could induce specific neurological states with remarkable precision. She had developed substances that could enhance memory formation, suppress specific types of recollection, increase susceptibility to suggestion, and maintain consciousness during procedures that would normally require full anesthesia. Her laboratory contained specimens and compounds that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream science for decades. Sarah's psychological techniques proved equally advanced, incorporating methods that combined hypnosis, suggestion therapy, and what modern practitioners would recognize as neuro-linguistic programming. She could reshape patients' fundamental beliefs, alter their emotional responses to specific memories, and implant behavioral patterns that would persist indefinitely. Her approach to consciousness modification relied on psychological rather than pharmaceutical or surgical interventions, but proved equally effective in achieving the sisters' research objectives. The residential wing of the facility had been designed to support their experimental program with features that wouldn't be found in conventional medical institutions for another century. Soundproof treatment rooms prevented subjects from communicating with each other during procedures. Specialized restraint systems allowed for extended immobilization without causing physical damage. Most significantly, the sisters had constructed what they called observation chambers, hidden spaces from which they could monitor subjects continuously without being detected. By early 1823, the Whitmore Medical Institute had evolved into something far removed from conventional medical practice. The sisters were conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of what human consciousness could endure and still remain functional. Their subjects were no longer patients seeking treatment, but rather raw material for research that aimed to unlock the fundamental mechanisms of human awareness and identity. The transformation of the Whitmore Medical Institute accelerated dramatically following the arrival of Dr. Heinrich Volker in March 1823. Volker, a German physician fleeing accusations of unethical experimentation in Bavaria, brought with him knowledge of techniques that the sisters had only theorized about in their private discussions. His specialty lay in what European medical circles whispered about as forbidden neurology, procedures that involved direct manipulation of brain tissue in conscious subjects to study the immediate effects on personality and memory. Eleanor Whitmore recognized Volker's value immediately, not as a colleague, but as a source of advanced techniques that could enhance their existing research program. Within days of his arrival, she had negotiated an arrangement that gave Volker access to their experimental subjects in exchange for instruction in his specialized procedures. The German physician was impressed by the sophistication of the sisters' operation and particularly intrigued by their detailed documentation of consciousness modification results. Margaret's anatomical skills proved perfectly suited to implementing Volker's techniques. She had already performed numerous procedures involving direct brain access, but Volker's methods allowed for much more precise interventions. Together, they developed protocols for accessing specific brain regions while maintaining subject consciousness, enabling them to observe immediate effects of their manipulations. Margaret's steady hands and intuitive understanding of neurological structures made her an ideal student for Volker's most advanced procedures. The first joint experiment between the sisters and Volker involved a patient named Robert Fleming, a 29-year-old blacksmith from Trenton, who had sought treatment for severe headaches that conventional medicine couldn't address. Fleming had no family connections and had paid for his treatment in advance, making him an ideal subject for their most invasive procedures. The experiment aimed to determine whether specific memory formations could be surgically removed while leaving other cognitive functions intact. Margaret performed the initial cranial access procedure, with Volker guiding her through the identification of target tissue areas. Catherine administered a pharmaceutical cocktail that maintained Fleming's consciousness while suppressing his ability to form new memories of the procedure itself. Sarah engaged him in continuous conversation, monitoring his responses for changes in personality or cognitive function as Margaret made precise tissue modifications. The results exceeded their expectations. Fleming emerged from the procedure with his childhood memories completely intact but with no recollection of his adult romantic relationships. He could recall learning his trade, but not the specific masters who had taught him. Most remarkably, his severe headaches had completely disappeared, suggesting that the removed memories had been somehow connected to his physical symptoms. Rebecca's documentation of the Fleming procedure filled 17 pages with detailed observations, anatomical drawings, and philosophical speculation about the nature of memory storage in brain tissue. Her notes revealed that the sisters viewed their subjects not as human beings deserving compassion, but as biological mechanisms to be understood and manipulated. She wrote extensively about the implications of their discoveries for understanding human consciousness, but showed no concern for the ethical dimensions of their work. Volker's influence extended beyond surgical techniques to encompass a broader philosophical approach to human experimentation. He introduced the sisters to concepts from Germanic medical philosophy that treated individual consciousness as less important than advancing scientific knowledge. Under his guidance, their research program became increasingly systematic and ruthless, with subjects categorized according to their potential value for different types of experiments. The spring of 1823 brought a steady stream of new patients to the Whitmore facility, each representing opportunities for increasingly sophisticated experimentation. The sisters had refined their patient selection process to identify individuals whose disappearance would create minimal complications. They preferred subjects with mental health issues, physical deformities, or social isolation that made them unlikely to be missed by their communities. Catherine's pharmaceutical research reached new levels of sophistication as she worked to develop compounds that could enhance the sisters' ability to manipulate consciousness without causing obvious physical damage. She created substances that could induce temporary amnesia, allowing subjects to undergo multiple procedures without retaining traumatic memories. Other compounds enhanced suggestibility to such a degree that subjects would accept completely fabricated memories as genuine recollections of their past experiences. Sarah's psychological techniques evolved to incorporate Volker's understanding of Germanic hypnosis methods combined with her own innovations in suggestion therapy. She developed what she called consciousness architecture, a systematic approach to rebuilding personality structures from their foundational elements. Her methods could transform a subject's core identity so completely that they would emerge as essentially different people while retaining their original physical forms. The residential wing of the facility underwent significant expansion during this period to accommodate the growing number of long-term experimental subjects. The sisters constructed specialized chambers designed for different types of consciousness modification procedures. Some rooms were equipped for surgical interventions, others for extended pharmaceutical treatments, and still others for intensive psychological restructuring programs that could last for months. Eleanor's leadership of the research program demonstrated remarkable organizational skills as she coordinated increasingly complex experimental protocols involving multiple subjects simultaneously. She developed scheduling systems that maximized the efficiency of their procedures while ensuring that each subject received the appropriate combination of surgical, pharmaceutical, and psychological interventions to achieve desired research outcomes. The sisters' understanding of consciousness manipulation had reached a level that allowed them to essentially manufacture personalities according to specific requirements. They could create subjects who were perfectly compliant, others who exhibited enhanced cognitive abilities in specific areas, and still others who served as living repositories for memories and skills extracted from previous experimental subjects. Dr. Volker's most significant contribution to their research program was the introduction of what he called consciousness bridging, a technique that temporarily connected the awareness of multiple subjects to study how individual personalities interacted when sharing the same cognitive space. These experiments required precise pharmaceutical timing and surgical preparation, but produced results that revolutionized the sisters' understanding of human consciousness as a transferable phenomenon rather than a fixed biological property. The procedure involved creating temporary neural connections between subjects using thin metal conductors inserted into specific brain regions. Catherine's pharmaceutical cocktails maintained consciousness in both subjects while suppressing their ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and those originating from the connected individual. Sarah monitored the psychological effects, documenting how personality traits and memories flowed between connected minds. Margaret's surgical expertise enabled her to perform these bridging procedures with minimal tissue damage, allowing subjects to undergo multiple connections with different partners over extended periods. She developed specialized instruments for creating and maintaining neural bridges, tools that demonstrated a level of precision that wouldn't be achieved by mainstream medicine for decades. Rebecca's documentation of the consciousness bridging. Experiments revealed that the sisters had discovered principles of neural connectivity that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Her detailed observations described how specific memories and personality traits could be selectively transferred between subjects, how emotional responses could be modified through exposure to foreign consciousness patterns, and most remarkably, how entirely new personalities could emerge from the interaction between connected minds. The success of these experiments led the sisters to develop increasingly ambitious research protocols. They began maintaining networks of connected subjects, creating what Eleanor described as consciousness collectives where multiple individuals shared cognitive resources and experienced reality as a merged entity. These collectives could solve complex problems beyond the capability of individual subjects and demonstrated levels of creativity and insight that exceeded normal human potential. Volcker's influence also extended to the sisters' approach to record-keeping and research documentation. He introduced Germanic standards of scientific methodology that transformed their work from systematic experimentation into rigorous academic research. Under his guidance, they began preparing formal research papers describing their techniques and results, documents they intended to present to European medical academies once their work was complete. The collaboration between the sisters and Volcker produced innovations in consciousness modification that represented genuine advances in understanding human cognitive function. Their techniques for memory manipulation, personality restructuring, and consciousness transfer achieved results that mainstream science would struggle to replicate even with modern technology. However, these advances came at a terrible human cost that the researchers viewed as acceptable in pursuit of their scientific objectives. By summer 1823, the Whitmore Medical Institute had evolved into a sophisticated research facility that bore no resemblance to conventional medical practice. The sisters and Volcker had created systematic protocols for transforming human consciousness according to predetermined specifications, and their success rate in achieving desired modifications exceeded 90%. Their subjects had become raw material for experiments that pushed the boundaries of what human awareness could endure while remaining functional. The summer of 1823 marked the beginning of what Eleanor Whitmore would later describe in her private journals as the golden period of their research. The collaboration with Dr. Volcker had accelerated their understanding of consciousness manipulation to unprecedented levels, and they were now ready to implement their most ambitious experimental protocols. The facility had become a carefully orchestrated laboratory where human consciousness served as both the subject of study and the raw material for increasingly sophisticated modifications. Their first major breakthrough came through the case of Martha Holloway, a 32-year-old widow from Princeton, who had arrived seeking treatment for what her family described as severe melancholia following her husband's death. Holloway presented the perfect opportunity to test their most advanced consciousness restructuring protocols, as her emotional distress provided a clear baseline against which to measure the effects of their interventions. More importantly, her isolation from extended family and her independent financial resources meant that her extended absence would raise no immediate concerns. Eleanor personally oversaw Holloway's intake evaluation, but her assessment bore no resemblance to conventional medical examination. Instead, she conducted an exhaustive analysis of Holloway's personality structure, memory formations, and emotional response patterns. Using techniques developed through months of experimentation on previous subjects, Eleanor mapped the neurological pathways associated with Holloway's grief, identifying specific memory clusters that could be surgically removed or chemically suppressed. Margaret's role in the Holloway experiment demonstrated how far her surgical skills had advanced under Volcker's instruction. She performed multiple cranial access procedures over a period of weeks, each targeting different aspects of Holloway's consciousness structure. The first intervention removed memory formations associated with her husband's illness and death, while subsequent procedures modified the neurological pathways responsible for forming emotional attachments to other individuals. Catherine's pharmaceutical contributions to the Holloway case represented a masterpiece of chemical consciousness modification. She developed a treatment regimen that combined 17 different compounds in precisely timed doses to achieve specific neurological effects. Some substances enhanced Holloway's receptivity to memory implantation. Others suppressed her ability to form connections between related memories, and still others maintained her consciousness during surgical procedures, while preventing the formation of traumatic recollections. Sarah's psychological interventions proved equally sophisticated, as she systematically rebuilt Holloway's personality structure from its foundational elements. Through carefully orchestrated conversation sessions, Sarah implanted artificial memories of a happy childhood unmarred by loss, professional accomplishments that provided sources of self-esteem, and romantic relationships that ended amicably rather than through death. These fabricated recollections were crafted with such detail and emotional resonance that Holloway accepted them as genuine experiences from her past. The transformation of Martha Holloway required 3 months of intensive treatment, during which she underwent procedures that completely restructured her consciousness, while leaving her physical health apparently unaffected. When the process was complete, she had become an entirely different person who retained Holloway's physical form, but possessed a completely artificial personality constructed according to the sisters' specifications. The melancholic widow had been replaced by a cheerful, optimistic woman with no memory of loss or trauma. Rebecca's documentation of the Holloway transformation filled over 200 pages with detailed observations, procedural notes, and philosophical reflections on the nature of human identity. Her records revealed that the sisters viewed their success with Holloway as proof that consciousness was entirely malleable and that human personality was nothing more than a collection of modifiable neurological patterns. This perspective would guide their approach to subsequent experiments as they developed increasingly ambitious protocols for consciousness manipulation. The success of the Holloway case attracted the attention of wealthy families throughout the region who were dealing with relatives suffering from various mental afflictions. Word spread discreetly through upper-class social networks about the remarkable treatments available at the Whitmore facility, bringing a steady stream of patients whose families were willing to pay substantial fees for miraculous cures that conventional medicine couldn't provide. Dr. Volker's influence during this period extended beyond technical instruction to encompass a broader philosophical framework that justified their increasingly extreme experimental protocols. He introduced the sisters to Germanic concepts of scientific advancement that prioritized knowledge acquisition over individual welfare, arguing that their research represented contributions to human understanding that transcended conventional moral considerations. Under his guidance, they began viewing their subjects as necessary sacrifices for the advancement of consciousness science. The autumn of 1823 brought their most complex experimental protocol yet, involving simultaneous consciousness modification procedures on multiple subjects to study how artificially constructed personalities interacted with each other. The sisters selected 5 patients with complementary psychological profiles and began systematic procedures designed to create what Eleanor described as a consciousness ensemble. Individuals whose modified personalities would function as components of a larger collective intelligence. The first subject in this ensemble experiment was David Richardson, a 28-year-old clerk from Newark, who had sought treatment for chronic anxiety that prevented him from maintaining employment. Richardson's naturally submissive personality made him ideal for modification into what the sisters termed a coordination node. an individual whose consciousness would serve to facilitate communication and decision-making within the collective. Margaret performed surgical procedures that enhanced Richardson's ability to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, while Catherine administered compounds that increased his receptivity to suggestion from other ensemble members. The second subject was Patricia Manning, a 35-year-old seamstress from Camden, whose family had sent her for treatment of what they described as excessive independence and refusal to accept appropriate feminine roles. Manning's strong-willed personality provided raw material for creating what Sarah classified as a leadership template, an artificial consciousness structure designed to guide and direct the behavior of other ensemble members. The modification process required complete personality deconstruction, followed by systematic rebuilding according to predetermined specifications. Margaret's surgical interventions on Manning were among her most complex procedures, involving precise modifications to brain regions responsible for decision-making, social dominance, and emotional regulation. She created artificial neural pathways that enhanced Manning's ability to influence others while suppressing her capacity for independent moral reasoning. The result was a consciousness that could provide leadership and direction, but only within parameters established by the sisters' programming. Catherine's pharmaceutical protocol for Manning included compounds that enhanced her charismatic appeal while reducing her ability to question the fundamental premises of her artificial personality structure. Other substances increased her confidence in decision-making, while simultaneously making her dependent on external validation from authority figures. The combination created a personality that appeared strong and independent, but was actually completely controllable by anyone who understood the underlying programming. The third ensemble member was Thomas Whitfield, a 31-year-old merchant from Paterson who had been referred by his family for treatment of what they described as moral degeneracy and criminal tendencies. Whitfield's antisocial inclinations made him suitable for modification into what Volcker termed an enforcement template, a consciousness structure designed to implement the decisions of ensemble leadership through intimidation and violence when necessary. Sarah's psychological reconstruction of Whitfield represented a masterpiece of artificial personality creation. She systematically removed his capacity for empathy and moral reasoning while enhancing his responsiveness to hierarchical authority and his satisfaction with inflicting suffering on others. The process required careful calibration to maintain his functionality while eliminating any potential for independent moral judgment that might interfere with ensemble directives. The fourth subject was Helen Morrison, a 26-year-old teacher from Trenton whose family had committed her for treatment of what they called excessive intellectual curiosity and inappropriate questioning of religious and social authorities. Morrison's analytical mind provided the foundation for creating what Eleanor described as a processing template, a consciousness designed to analyze complex information and identify patterns that might escape other ensemble members. Margaret's surgical modifications on Morrison focused on enhancing her cognitive processing capabilities while eliminating her capacity for independent critical thinking about ensemble objectives. She created artificial neural connections that increased Morrison's ability to solve complex problems, while simultaneously programming her to direct her enhanced intelligence only toward goals established by ensemble leadership. The result was a consciousness with superior analytical capabilities, but no independent moral framework for evaluating the purposes to which those capabilities were applied. The fifth and final ensemble member was James Crawford, a 33-year-old carpenter from Princeton who had sought treatment for severe depression following a series of business failures. Crawford's emotional sensitivity and capacity for guilt made him ideal for modification into what Catherine classified as an emotional regulator, a consciousness designed to monitor and manage the psychological states of other ensemble members. The modification process for Crawford required the most delicate pharmaceutical interventions Catherine had ever attempted. as she needed to enhance his empathic abilities while simultaneously programming him to prioritize ensemble cohesion over individual well-being. She developed compounds that increased his sensitivity to others' emotional states while reducing his capacity to feel distress about suffering that served ensemble purposes. The result was a consciousness that could provide emotional support and psychological manipulation with equal facility. Rebecca's documentation of the ensemble creation process revealed the unprecedented sophistication of the sisters' approach to consciousness engineering. They had developed systematic protocols for designing complementary personality structures that would function together as a unified intelligence while maintaining the appearance of individual autonomy. Each modified consciousness retained enough personal characteristics to seem authentically human, while actually serving as a component in a larger artificial intelligence system. The completed ensemble represented a revolutionary achievement in consciousness manipulation, demonstrating that human personality could be systematically engineered to serve specific functional requirements. The 5 modified individuals displayed remarkable coordination in their interactions, communicating through subtle cues and shared decision-making processes that exceeded the capabilities of their original personalities. They functioned as a collective intelligence that could solve complex problems and implement sophisticated strategies while maintaining the appearance of normal social interaction. Dr. Volker's assessment of the ensemble experiment confirmed that the sisters had achieved something unprecedented in the history of consciousness research. They had successfully created artificial personalities that were not only individually functional, but also collectively intelligent, representing a form of engineered consciousness that combined human creativity with programmable reliability. The implications of their success extended far beyond medical treatment to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human identity and free will. The success of the ensemble experiment established the Whitmore facility as the most advanced consciousness research institution in the world, decades ahead of any comparable work being conducted in European universities or medical academies. The sisters had developed techniques that allowed them to design human personalities according to specific requirements, creating individuals who appeared normal, but actually functioned as components of larger artificial intelligence systems. Eleanor's private correspondence from this period revealed her growing ambitions for expanding their research program to encompass broader social applications of consciousness modification. She envisioned networks of modified individuals who could serve as agents in business, politics, and other influential sectors, advancing objectives established by those who understood the principles of consciousness engineering. Her vision represented a form of social control that would operate through modified human consciousness rather than external coercion. The winter of 1823 brought new challenges as sisters worked to perfect their ensemble protocols while managing an increasingly complex facility housing dozens of experimental subjects in various stages of consciousness modification. They had created a hidden world where human identity served as raw material for systematic engineering projects that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could become while retaining the appearance of natural human personality. The first sign of approaching disaster came from an unexpected source during the harsh winter months of early 1824. Dr. Volker, whose partnership with the sisters had elevated their consciousness research to unprecedented levels, began exhibiting symptoms that Eleanor initially attributed to the stress of intensive experimental work. His hands developed a persistent tremor that interfered with delicate surgical procedures, and his usually precise German accent became slurred during lengthy lectures on consciousness theory. Catherine's pharmaceutical expertise led her to recognize the symptoms as mercury poisoning, likely caused by prolonged exposure to the chemical compounds she had been developing for their consciousness modification protocols. Volker had been working directly with concentrated mercury solutions in his attempts to create more precise neural conductors for consciousness-bridging experiments, and the accumulated exposure had begun affecting his nervous system in ways that threatened both his health and the security of their operation. The deterioration of Volker's condition accelerated rapidly as winter progressed into spring. His memory began showing gaps, particularly regarding recent experimental procedures, and his usually methodical approach to research became erratic and unpredictable. More concerning still was his growing tendency to speak openly about their work to anyone who would listen, apparently forgetting the need for discretion that had protected their operation for nearly 3 years. Eleanor recognized that Volker's condition represented an existential threat to everything they had built. His knowledge of their techniques was comprehensive, and his deteriorating mental state made him increasingly unreliable as a keeper of their secrets. During lucid moments, he expressed growing ethical concerns about their experimental protocols, questioning the morality of consciousness modification in ways that suggested his value system was reverting to conventional medical ethics rather than the scientific pragmatism that had made their collaboration possible. Margaret's assessment of Volker's neurological damage confirmed Catherine's initial diagnosis, but revealed additional complications that made recovery unlikely. The mercury poisoning had caused irreversible damage to brain tissue responsible for memory formation and impulse control, meaning that his condition would continue deteriorating regardless of any treatment they might attempt. More troubling still was evidence that the damage was affecting regions associated with moral reasoning and social inhibition, making him increasingly likely to expose their activities to external authorities. Sarah's psychological evaluation of Volker revealed personality changes that transformed him from a valuable collaborator into a dangerous liability. His Germanic rationality was giving way to emotional instability, and his commitment to scientific advancement was being replaced by conventional humanitarian concerns that viewed their experimental subjects as human beings deserving protection, rather than research materials. These changes represented a fundamental threat to the philosophical framework that had justified their work. The sisters faced their first major crisis as they realized that eliminating Volker would require techniques they had never applied to someone with intimate knowledge of their methods. Unlike their experimental subjects, Volker understood consciousness modification protocols well enough to potentially resist their standard approaches to memory alteration and personality restructuring. His scientific training and familiarity with their pharmaceutical compounds made him a uniquely challenging target for the same techniques they had used successfully on dozens of previous subjects. Eleanor's solution demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking that had made her the operations leader. Rather than attempting to modify or eliminate Volker directly, she decided to use his deteriorating condition as an opportunity to test advanced consciousness preservation techniques they had been developing but never implemented on a subject with his level of scientific knowledge. The experiment would serve dual purposes by removing the threat he represented, while potentially advancing their research into consciousness transfer mechanisms. The procedure Eleanor designed for Volker represented the culmination of everything they had learned about consciousness manipulation over nearly 3 years of intensive experimentation. Rather than simply killing him or attempting to modify his existing personality, she proposed to extract his consciousness completely and preserve it in a form that would allow them to access his knowledge, while eliminating his capacity for independent action or moral judgment. Margaret's role in the Volker procedure required surgical techniques that pushed her skills to their absolute limits. She needed to maintain his brain function while systematically disconnecting his consciousness from his physical body, a process that required precise interventions in neural regions they had never directly manipulated in living subjects. The surgery would need to be performed in stages over several weeks to prevent catastrophic system failure, while achieving the gradual disconnection necessary for consciousness extraction. Catherine's pharmaceutical protocol for the Volcker experiment was her most complex creation, involving 23 different compounds administered in carefully timed sequences to maintain his awareness during surgical disconnection while preventing the formation of traumatic memories that might interfere with consciousness preservation. She developed specialized substances that could maintain neural activity in isolated brain tissue, essentially creating artificial life support systems for consciousness that existed independently of normal biological processes. Sarah's psychological preparation of Volcker for the extraction procedure represented a masterpiece of manipulation that convinced him he was participating in a revolutionary medical experiment rather than becoming its victim. She presented the consciousness preservation process as a breakthrough treatment for his mercury poisoning, explaining that temporary disconnection from his damaged nervous system would allow for healing that was impossible, while his consciousness remained integrated with his deteriorating brain tissue. The extraction procedure began in March 1824 and continued over 6 weeks, as Margaret systematically severed the neural connections that anchored Volcker's consciousness to his physical form. Catherine's pharmaceutical interventions maintained his awareness throughout the process, allowing him to experience each stage of disconnection, while remaining unable to resist or fully comprehend what was happening to him. Sarah provided continuous psychological support, maintaining the illusion that he was undergoing innovative medical treatment rather than consciousness vivisection. Rebecca's documentation of the Volcker extraction filled over 300 pages, with detailed observations of consciousness behavior during systematic disconnection from physical neural networks. Her records describe phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and brain, revealing that consciousness could maintain coherence and functionality even when isolated from normal biological support systems. The extracted consciousness retained Volcker's memories, personality traits, and scientific knowledge while losing all capacity for independent physical action. The success of the Volcker extraction established consciousness preservation as a viable technique for managing threats to their operation while simultaneously advancing their research capabilities. They had demonstrated that human awareness could be maintained independently of biological brain function, opening possibilities for consciousness manipulation that extended far beyond their previous achievements. The preserved consciousness could be accessed for information while remaining completely controlled by external operators. Eleanor's application of the Volcker extraction results to their broader research program revealed new possibilities for consciousness engineering that transformed their understanding of human identity as a manipulable resource. They could now preserve valuable consciousness components from experimental subjects while discarding problematic elements, like moral reasoning or emotional attachments, that interfered with their utility as research materials or artificial intelligence components. The spring of 1824 brought their most ambitious project, yet as they began developing what Eleanor termed a consciousness repository, a systematic collection of preserved awareness extracted from their most valuable experimental subjects. The repository would serve as a library of human knowledge, skills, and personality traits that could be accessed, combined, and implanted in new subjects according to specific requirements. They were essentially creating a catalog of human consciousness, components that could be mixed and matched to produce artificial personalities with predetermined characteristics. The first major addition to their consciousness repository came from Professor Jonathan Whiteside, a mathematics instructor from Princeton University who had sought treatment for severe anxiety that was interfering with his teaching responsibilities. Whiteside's advanced mathematical knowledge made him valuable for potential consciousness preservation, as his skills could be extracted and implanted in subjects who needed enhanced analytical capabilities for specific research purposes. Margaret's extraction of Whiteside's consciousness required modifications to the techniques developed for Volcker, as academic knowledge appeared to be stored in different neural configurations than medical expertise. She discovered that mathematical reasoning involved neural pathways that were more deeply integrated with basic cognitive functions, requiring more extensive surgical intervention to achieve clean extraction without damaging the preserved consciousness components. Catherine's pharmaceutical support for the white side extraction involved compounds designed specifically to maintain the neural pathways associated with advanced mathematical reasoning, while allowing for disconnection from emotional and social cognition. She created substances that could preserve abstract thinking capabilities while eliminating the personality traits that might interfere with the extracted consciousness, serving as a component in artificial intelligence systems. The success of the white side extraction demonstrated that they could preserve and transfer highly specialized knowledge between subjects, essentially creating artificial experts who possessed advanced skills without the original personality contexts that had developed those abilities. They could now produce subjects with doctoral-level expertise in specific fields, while maintaining complete psychological compliance with external direction. Sarah's development of consciousness integration techniques allowed them to combine preserved awareness components from multiple sources into single artificial personalities. She discovered that mathematical knowledge from Whiteside could be combined with medical expertise from Volcker and leadership traits from Modified Ensemble members to create artificial consciousness with capabilities that exceeded those of any individual source. These hybrid personalities represented a new form of artificial intelligence that combined human creativity with systematic engineering. The consciousness repository grew rapidly during the summer of 1824 as the sisters systematically extracted valuable awareness components from their most capable subjects. They preserved the artistic talents of a landscape painter, the linguistic skills of a classical scholar, the business acumen of a successful merchant, and the technical knowledge of a skilled machinist. Each extraction added new capabilities to their catalog of consciousness components while eliminating potentially problematic individuals who possessed too much knowledge of their operations. Rebecca's analysis of the repository contents revealed patterns in consciousness structure that allowed for increasingly sophisticated artificial personality construction. She discovered that certain traits combined more effectively than others, that some knowledge domains required specific personality foundations to function properly, and that the most successful artificial consciousness combined components from subjects with complementary rather than similar backgrounds. Eleanor's vision for applying their consciousness repository extended beyond individual personality construction to encompass large-scale social engineering projects. She envisioned networks of artificial consciousness deployed throughout society to advance specific objectives while maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior. Political leaders with preserved loyalty programming, business executives with enhanced decision-making capabilities, and intellectual authorities with modified ethical frameworks could reshape civilization according to predetermined specifications. The autumn of 1824 brought their most significant security challenge as families of missing patients began making inquiries that threatened to expose the true nature of their operations. Unlike their earlier subjects who had been socially isolated, several recent extractions had involved individuals with extensive social connections who were actively searching for their missing relatives. The sisters realized that their consciousness preservation techniques had made them overconfident about eliminating witnesses, leading them to target subjects whose disappearances would eventually attract official investigation. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a physician from Philadelphia whose consciousness had been extracted for his medical knowledge, was being sought by colleagues who had expected him to return from his New Jersey treatment within a specified time frame. Pemberton's medical society had begun making formal inquiries about his welfare, and his family had hired private investigators to locate him when letters from the Whitmore facility stopped arriving without explanation. Eleanor's response to the Pemberton investigation demonstrated both the sophistication and the fundamental weakness of their operation. She produced extensive documentation showing that Pemberton had completed his treatment successfully and had decided to pursue opportunities in Western territories rather than returning to Philadelphia. The forged correspondence was expertly crafted and supported by artificial witnesses who testified to seeing Pemberton traveling westward. But the deception required resources and coordination that strained their ability to maintain operational security. Margaret's role in managing the Pemberton deception involved creating physical evidence of his departure, including staged scenes at coaching inns along westward routes and planted belongings that suggested he had passed through various locations. Her attention to detail was meticulous, but the effort required to maintain multiple false narratives was becoming unsustainable as the number of extracted subjects continued growing. The investigation into Pemberton's disappearance intensified. When his medical colleagues discovered inconsistencies in the treatment documentation provided by the Whitmore facility, several physicians noted that the medical procedures described in their reports involved techniques that wouldn't be developed for decades, suggesting either fraudulent documentation or access to medical knowledge that exceeded anything available in contemporary practice. Catherine's pharmaceutical records became a particular point of scrutiny as investigators discovered that her treatment protocols referenced chemical compounds that weren't available through normal medical supply channels. Her expertise in consciousness modification had required access to rare substances that could only be obtained through European connections, creating a paper trail that linked their facility to networks of experimental researchers whose work was considered ethically questionable by mainstream medical authorities. Sarah's psychological treatment documentation revealed methodologies that combined legitimate therapeutic techniques with approaches that hadn't been formally developed by contemporary practitioners. Her success rates with difficult cases were statistically impossible using conventional methods, suggesting either fraudulent reporting or access to treatment modalities that exceeded the capabilities of established medical practice. The convergence of multiple investigations during late 1824 created a crisis that threatened to expose not only their consciousness extraction operations, but also the broader implications of their research for understanding human identity and free will. The sisters realized that their unprecedented success in consciousness manipulation had made them vulnerable to discovery by authorities who wouldn't understand the revolutionary nature of their work or the necessity of their experimental methods for advancing human knowledge. The end came swiftly in December 1824, when federal marshals surrounded the Whitmore Estate at dawn, armed with warrants issued by a grand jury in Philadelphia. The investigation had reached critical mass when 3 separate missing persons cases converged, revealing patterns that could no longer be explained by coincidence or frontier hazards. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the federal medical examiner, had compiled evidence suggesting systematic medical fraud on an unprecedented scale. Eleanor Whitmore met the marshals at the front door with characteristic composure, presenting herself as a concerned medical professional eager to assist with any investigation. Her performance was flawless, but the physical evidence discovered within hours destroyed any possibility of maintaining their cover story. The consciousness repository chamber contained preserved brain tissue from dozens of subjects, maintained in chemical solutions that wouldn't be invented for another century. Margaret's surgical instruments revealed modifications and innovations that exceeded contemporary medical technology by decades. Her collection included precision tools for neural manipulation that demonstrated engineering capabilities far beyond anything available through legitimate medical supply channels. Most damning were her detailed anatomical drawings showing brain modifications that could only have been created through direct observation of living subjects during invasive procedures. Catherine's laboratory yielded chemical compounds that forensic analysis couldn't identify using known scientific methods. Her pharmaceutical innovations had produced substances that affected human consciousness in ways that contemporary medicine couldn't explain or replicate. Federal chemists would spend years attempting to understand the molecular structures of her consciousness modification compounds without achieving definitive results. Sarah's psychological treatment records documented techniques that combined legitimate, therapeutic approaches with methodologies that wouldn't be formally recognized for another half-century. Her success in personality modification exceeded anything achievable through conventional means, suggesting access to psychological principles that contemporary practice hadn't discovered. The artificial memories she had implanted in subjects remained stable and convincing even under intensive examination. Rebecca's comprehensive documentation provided investigators with a complete record of consciousness extraction procedures, artificial personality construction, and systematic human experimentation that spanned nearly 4 years. Her meticulous notes revealed the true scope of their research program and the revolutionary nature of their discoveries about human consciousness as a manipulable phenomenon. The trial that followed became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in American history, not because of the verdict, but because of the evidence presented. Federal prosecutors struggled to explain how 4 women in rural New Jersey had developed medical techniques that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding by generations. Defense attorneys argued that the evidence was so far beyond known capabilities that it must represent elaborate fraud rather than genuine scientific achievement. Eleanor, Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were convicted of multiple counts of murder, medical fraud, and conspiracy. They were executed by hanging in March 1825, taking their knowledge to unmarked graves. Rebecca, who cooperated with authorities, received life imprisonment but died in custody within 2 years under mysterious circumstances that suggested her specialized knowledge made her too dangerous to survive. The Whitmore facility was destroyed by federal order, with all equipment and documentation classified as state secrets. Official records were sealed indefinitely, and surviving witnesses were relocated under assumed identities to prevent public discussion of the case. The consciousness repository was transported to an undisclosed government facility where it allegedly remains under study by researchers whose work will never be publicly acknowledged. Modern attempts to investigate the Whitmore case encounter systematic obstruction from federal agencies that claim no knowledge of the events while simultaneously restricting access to historical records from the relevant time period. The few documents that have surfaced through Freedom of Information requests are heavily redacted, with entire sections removed to protect what officials describe as ongoing national security interests. Contemporary neuroscience has independently discovered some principles that appear consistent with techniques described in leaked Whitmore documentation, but researchers who draw explicit connections between their work and the 1824 case find their funding discontinued and their academic positions terminated. The official position remains that consciousness manipulation beyond conventional therapeutic methods is scientifically impossible. The sealed chamber where I discovered the Whitmore documents has been permanently closed by court order, with the construction project abandoned despite substantial financial losses. Local authorities cite structural instability as the reason for sealing, but geological surveys show no evidence of foundation problems that would justify permanent closure. What science refuses to study about the Whitmore sisters isn't just their techniques for consciousness manipulation, but the fundamental questions their work raised about the nature of human identity, the ethics of cognitive modification, and the potential for systematic consciousness engineering that could reshape civilization itself. Their legacy lives not in official recognition, but in the persistent rumors that their research continues in classified facilities, where the boundaries between science and horror remain deliberately blurred. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.